The storm and the stranger. The fluorescent lights buzzed harshly in the near-empty laundromat, casting an eerie glow over the rows of silent washing machines. Outside, the rain came down in torrents, hammering against the glass windows and turning the cracked sidewalks into shallow rivers. The clock on the wall ticked steadily. 2:13 a.m., an hour when most of the world was asleep, safe in their homes, warm under blankets. But not everyone. The door chimed weakly as it swung open, letting in a gust of frigid air and rain. Tiny, unsteady feet padded across the grimy linoleum floor, leaving behind a trail of wet footprints. The child, no more than 3 years old, was drenched from head to toe. Her dark curls clung to her face, water dripping steadily from her chin. She wore nothing but a thin, soaked dress that barely covered her trembling frame. In her small arms, she carried something, a bundle wrapped in a damp, tattered blanket. No one looked up. Behind the counter, the cashier, a middle-aged woman with graying hair, barely glanced at the shivering toddler before turning back to her magazine. She'd seen too much in this part of town to care about one more lost soul. "No kids allowed this late," she muttered, flipping a page. The little girl's lip trembled, but she didn't cry. She had learned early that crying never helped. Instead, she stepped forward, her bare feet slapping wetly against the floor. "Please," she whispered, barely more than a breath. "My sister, she won't wake up." The cashier sighed, looking up again with mild annoyance. Her eyes flicked toward the bundle in the child's arms. The way it lay motionless, the way the little girl held it so desperately, should have concerned her. But concern was something she couldn't afford. "Go find your mama," the cashier said flatly. The little girl swallowed hard. "I can't." Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Then, slowly, her wide, tear-filled eyes darted around the laundromat, searching, pleading, for anyone who might listen. The place was nearly deserted. A row of empty folding tables stood against the far wall, a few abandoned socks and a crumpled receipt, the only signs that anyone had been here recently. The only other occupant sat in the corner, half hidden by shadows, hunched over in layers of ragged clothing. A man. The first thing the girl noticed was his smell, stale, like old coffee, sweat, and rain-soaked cardboard. He was wrapped in a heavy, patched-up coat, his hood pulled low over his face, concealing all but his unshaven chin. He didn't move, didn't even acknowledge her presence. Ava hesitated. Something about him was different from the other men she had seen sleeping on benches and under stairwells. He wasn't sprawled out, lost in drunken sleep. He sat with his back straight, his hands resting steadily on his knees, unmoving, as if waiting. She swallowed hard and took a shaky step forward. The cashier was still watching her, frowning now, as if wondering why she hadn't left yet. Ava ignored her. Her heart pounded in her chest. Her baby sister felt so cold in her arms. She had to try. "Mister," she whispered. No reaction. She took another step closer, her small, wet footprints the only sound between the relentless drumming of rain outside. "Please," she whispered again, her voice cracking. "Help my sister." The man remained as still as the machines around him. Ava's vision blurred with tears. She's going to die. For a long, breathless moment, nothing changed. The fluorescent lights continued their endless buzz. The rain kept beating against the windows. The clock ticked. Then, so slight it was almost imperceptible, his shoulders stiffened. A slow inhale. The air in the room seemed to shift. And then, without a word, the man moved. What happened next was so sudden, so precise, that Ava barely had time to react. One moment, he was a hunched-over, faceless figure. The next, he was pushing back his hood, revealing a face that was lined with age but sharp with awareness. His blue eyes, clear, alert, locked onto the bundle in her arms. His hands moved with a practiced efficiency that no ordinary vagrant should possess. He was already kneeling before her, reaching out, his voice gravelly but firm. "Let me see her." Ava hesitated. Instinct told her to clutch Nia tighter. She didn't trust strangers, but something in his voice, something in his eyes, made her believe he knew what he was doing. Slowly, she let go. He took the baby carefully, his hand steady as he unwrapped the damp blanket. His expression darkened immediately. Too still. Too cold. He pressed 2 fingers against her tiny throat, waiting. Seconds stretched into eternity. Behind them, the cashier leaned forward slightly, curiosity finally breaking through her indifference. "Hey," she called out, uncertainty creeping into her tone. "What do you think you're—" "She's not breathing." The words were quiet, but they cut through the laundromat like a gunshot. Ava's small hands flew to her mouth. Is she? He didn't answer. Instead, he was already moving, tilting Nia's head back with careful precision. His fingers swept through her mouth, clearing her airway with the practiced motion of someone who had done this before. He leaned down, sealing his lips over her tiny mouth, and gave 2 gentle breaths. Carla shot to her feet. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The man ignored her. His eyes never left the baby's face. Another breath. Then another. Ava's chest ached. She clasped her hands together so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Please, please, please." The washing machines continued their steady rhythm. The mundane sound felt like a cruel joke. Then, a sound. A tiny, weak gasp. Nia's chest hitched, her little body shuddering. Ava's breath left her in a broken sob. She's alive. Relief crashed over her so hard that her legs nearly gave out. But the man wasn't finished. He sat back slightly, his hands trembling, for the first time since he had begun. He wiped sweat from his brow, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. "She needs a hospital," he said, his voice tight with urgency. His eyes flicked up to Ava's. Now, outside, the rain kept falling, drumming steadily against the pavement, and somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed. The man who knew too much. The laundromat felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as silence filled the air. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the steady beat of rain against the windows, and the distant roar of thunder were the only sounds aside from Ava's ragged breathing. The man held Nia close, his fingers pressing gently against the soft skin of her neck. He had done something impossible. He had brought her back. Ava's small body trembled with relief and fear as she reached out to touch her baby sister's face. Nia's tiny chest rose and fell, uneven and shallow, but she was breathing. She was alive. The man exhaled sharply, adjusting Nia in his arms with an efficiency that made Ava's heart race. He moved like a doctor, not like the men she saw sleeping on park benches or the ones Mama warned her to stay away from. "Where's the nearest hospital?" His voice was rough, controlled. Carla, the laundromat cashier, took a hesitant step forward. Her face, usually hardened with years of dealing with the worst this neighborhood had to offer, showed something close to concern now. But the walls she had built around herself, walls of detachment and cynicism, didn't fall so easily. "That baby needs more than just a hospital," she muttered. "She needs child services." Ava flinched. Her grip on her dress tightened as panic shot through her small body. "No," she whispered. She'd heard the stories. Kids taken away. Families broken. They said it was supposed to help, but nobody ever came back the same. The man's blue eyes flickered toward Carla, sharp and assessing. Then, without another word, he shifted Nia's weight and turned toward the door. "Where are you going?" Carla demanded. "Hospital." His tone left no room for argument. Eva scrambled after him, her bare feet slipping on the wet floor. Carla hesitated only a second before snatching her phone off the counter. "This isn't right," she muttered, fingers hovering over the keypad. But even as she punched in the numbers, she hesitated. "Yeah, we got a situation here. A homeless guy just—" She paused, glancing at the door as it swung shut behind them. She had no idea what she had just witnessed, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure if calling the cops was the right thing to do. the street, and the shadows. Outside, the rain poured harder, turning the street into a river of reflections. Neon signs from the liquor store down the block, the dull glow of distant streetlights, the flickering yellow of a dying traffic signal. The man moved quickly, his stride long and sure. Ava struggled to keep up, her feet splashing through puddles, her dress clinging to her small frame. "Hey," she finally called out. "Wait." He stopped abruptly, turning just enough for her to see his face. His hood had slipped slightly, revealing deep-set lines of exhaustion. And something else, something she couldn't quite name. She had seen tired men before, men who had lost too much and had nothing left. But this wasn't just tired. This was a man running from something. "You can't just leave me," Ava said, her voice breaking. You can't take Nia without me." His eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time since he had touched Nia, he looked hesitant. "I'm not leaving you," he said. "I'm getting her help." Ava swallowed hard, blinking rain from her eyes. "Then I'm coming too." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he shifted Nia in his arms and nodded toward the street. "We need a ride." Ava turned, scanning the empty road. A few flickering neon signs reflected in the puddles, and an old sedan rolled slowly down the block, its tires cutting through the water like a ghost passing through the city. The man lifted his arm, flagging the car down. A cab. The driver, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a cigarette dangling from his lips, slowed but didn't stop. He hesitated, taking in the sight. A ragged man, a soaking wet little girl, and an unconscious baby. The man took a step closer, shielding Nia from the rain. "Mercy, General," he said firmly. The cabbie hesitated. "You got money?" The man reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a few crumpled bills. The driver studied him for a long second, then finally sighed, unlocking the doors. Ava scrambled in first, her tiny hands shaking as she pulled herself onto the seat. The man followed, careful with Nia, cradling her in his arms like she was the most fragile thing in the world. The door slammed shut. As the cab pulled away from the curb, the city lights blurred behind them, disappearing into the storm. The ghost of a man. The cab smelled like cigarette smoke and cheap air freshener. The heater blasted hot air, making Ava shiver as her frozen skin started to thaw. The driver eyed them through the rearview mirror. "That kid don't look good." "She'll make it," the man said, his voice tight. Ava swallowed hard, looking up at him. He still hadn't told her his name. She tugged on his sleeve. "Who are you?" He glanced down at her, his expression unreadable. "Nobody," he muttered. Ava frowned. "You knew how to help her," she said. "You did something to her. Something. Doctors do." He looked away, staring out the rain-streaked window. "I've seen doctors before," Ava continued, her voice small. "Mama used to take Nia to the free clinic. They wore coats and smelled like soap." She hesitated. "You don't smell like soap." A tiny smile coasted across his lips, but it was gone before it fully formed. "No, I don't," he admitted. "So what are you?" she asked. For a long time, he didn't answer. The cab's tires splashed through the water, and Ava watched the raindrops race each other down the window. Finally, he sighed. "I used to be someone," he said. "A long time ago." Ava blinked up at him, waiting. "But I lost everything," he added quietly. She frowned. "Did someone take it?" He hesitated, his grip on Nia tightening. "Yes," he said. Ava stared at him, trying to understand. "Is that why you hide?" His blue eyes flickered toward her, sharp despite their exhaustion. "You ask a lot of questions." She crossed her arms. "Nia asks more." For the first time, something like warmth flickered in his expression. Then suddenly, his face darkened. The cab had slowed, pulling up in front of the emergency room doors. The harsh fluorescent lights spilled onto the street, reflecting off the wet pavement like a beacon. and waiting for them at the entrance were 2 police officers. The driver let out a low whistle. "Looks like someone's waiting for you." The man's body tensed. Ava's stomach twisted. She didn't know much about the police, only that they took people away. "Come on," the man muttered, shifting Nia in his arms. Ava scrambled after him as he threw a few bills onto the front seat. The door swung open. The moment they stepped onto the pavement, the red and blue lights flashing in the distance seemed to grow brighter. Ava's fingers found the man's sleeve, gripping it tightly. He didn't shake her off. He just whispered 2 words. "Stay close." Then, together, they stepped into the hospital, and into whatever waited for them inside. The past that won't stay buried. The emergency room doors slid open with a whoosh, spilling them into a world of blinding fluorescent lights, the sharp scent of antiseptic, and the distant murmur of medical personnel rushing between patients. The man's body tensed the moment they stepped inside. He knew this place, or places like it. Ava clutched his sleeve, her small fingers damp with rain and sweat. She didn't understand everything happening, but she knew one thing: Nia was getting help. That was all that mattered. But the man knew better. The moment he had seen the cops waiting outside, he had felt the old instincts kicking in. Fight, flight, disappear. But he couldn't run. Not now. Because of them. Because of these 2 little girls who had stumbled into his life. And because of what he had done. A nurse in bright scrubs spotted them immediately, her eyes widening as she took in the soaking wet, shivering child and the limp baby in the man's arms. "Somebody get a crash cart," she shouted over her shoulder, already rushing toward them. "We need a pediatric team. Now." Ava's grip on his sleeve tightened as a team of nurses and doctors sprang into motion. "Sir, give me the baby," a woman in a white coat ordered, her hands reaching out. For the briefest moment, he hesitated, not because he didn't trust them, but because giving her up felt like losing something, like handing over a life he had just barely saved. But he had no choice. Slowly, he unwrapped Nia from the damp blanket and passed her over. She looked impossibly small in the doctor's arms. The moment she was in their care, the team wheeled her toward the trauma room, her tiny body disappearing behind swinging doors. Ava let out a small, choked sob. "She'll be okay," the man murmured, resting a hand on her trembling shoulder. But he had no idea if that was true. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. And that was when the cops moved in. A man without a name. "Sir," one of the officers said, stepping closer, "we need you to come with us." The man slowly turned his head, his sharp blue eyes locking onto them. Ava inhaled sharply, pressing herself against his side. "No," she whispered, her voice so small it almost disappeared beneath the beeping monitors and distant calls of the medical staff. The officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with tired eyes, sighed. "We just need to ask you some questions." The man glanced at Ava, then back at the officers. "Not here," he said. The other officer, a younger woman with short-cropped hair, frowned. "Sir, I'm not going anywhere," he interrupted. "But that little girl just lost everything. Let me sit with her, just for a minute." Ava's breath hitched. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she knew one thing: she didn't want him to leave. The officers exchanged glances. Then, finally, the man with tired eyes nodded. "All right, 1 minute." The man exhaled slowly, then crouched beside Ava. Her small hands clutched at the fabric of his coat. "Are they taking you away?" she asked in a whisper. His jaw tightened. "I don't know." Her lip trembled. "But you helped Nia." He let out a low breath, running a hand through his damp, graying hair. "This world doesn't always work the way it should," he said quietly. Ava sniffled, swiping at her wet cheeks with the sleeve of her dress. "That's not fair." He smiled faintly. "No, it's not." Ava's hands curled into tiny fists. "You can't leave." The man swallowed hard, his throat tightening. "I don't want to. The officer behind them cleared his throat. "Sir." The man sighed, then slowly stood. Ava's hand shot out, grabbing his. "Promise me you'll come back," she whispered. His fingers closed around hers, warm despite the cold night. "I promise." The words felt like a lie, but he said them anyway. Then, with one last glance at the little girl who had somehow broken through his walls, he let go and let them take him away. A name, a crime, a ghost. The police station smelled like stale coffee and sweat. The fluorescent lights hummed above, casting their cold glow over rows of desks cluttered with papers and half-empty cups. The man sat in a metal chair, his wrists cuffed to the table. A familiar position. Too familiar. Across from him, Detective Carl Reynolds dropped a thick file onto the table. The folder was old, its edges frayed, the label faded with time. But the name on it was still clear. Langston Peter. The man barely reacted, just stared at it. Reynolds sat down with a sigh, rubbing his temples before leaning forward. His voice, when he spoke, was slow, deliberate. "You should have stayed gone." The man, Peter Langston, exhaled slowly through his nose. "Maybe." Reynolds flipped open the file, revealing a stack of papers, old photographs, and faded newspaper clippings. "You know what this is?" he asked, tapping the yellowed pages. Langston didn't answer. "It's your life, or what's left of it." Reynolds pulled out one of the clippings, reading aloud. "Renowned pediatric surgeon Peter Langston disappears after malpractice scandal." His eyes flicked up, searching for a reaction. Langston gave him none. Reynolds tossed the clipping aside. "You vanished 20 years ago. No bank accounts, no job records, no home. Just gone." Langston said nothing. Reynolds leaned forward, his expression sharp. "And now you turn up in the middle of the night, saving a dying baby in a laundromat." He shook his head, almost laughing. "You're either the world's unluckiest fugitive, or there's something you're not telling me." Langston let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off invisible weight. "The baby," he said finally. "Is she okay?" Reynolds studied him. "You care?" Langston's jaw clenched. "Of course I care." Reynolds tapped his fingers against the table, watching him. "Why?" Langston lifted his eyes, and for the first time since sitting down, there was fire in them. "Because I didn't kill her." Reynolds went still. Langston's voice was steady now, cold steel beneath the years of rust. "I never killed anyone." Reynolds watched him carefully. Then, slowly, he reached into the file and pulled out something else. A piece of paper. Langston's breath caught the moment he saw it, because he recognized the signature at the bottom. Dr. Anthony Caldwell, the man who had destroyed his life. Reynolds slid the document across the table. Langston stared. The words blurred, then sharpened, and everything changed. It was a confession. Ava's voice echoed in his head. "You can't leave." His fingers twitched. A choice. One he had never been given. Until now. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for the paper. His past had finally caught up to him. But this time, he wasn't running. The truth buried beneath lies. The weight of a name. Peter Langston had spent 20 years without a name. It had been stripped from him, buried beneath false accusations, headlines that condemned him before a trial ever began, and the whispers of people who once called him a friend. Now, in the cold, sterile interrogation room, under the flickering fluorescent lights, his name was back. And it carried the weight of 2 decades. The document in front of him trembled slightly as his fingers tightened around it. The paper was old, slightly yellowed, the ink smudged in places. But the words were clear. A confession. Dr. Anthony Caldwell lied. He and the hospital board fabricated evidence to protect their own. Langston's jaw clenched, his breath coming slow and measured. He forced himself to read every word, even as old wounds reopened, even as memories of that night came rushing back like a flood. The little girl on the operating table, the monitor's flatline tone still echoing in his head, Caldwell's cold, clinical voice telling him it was over. The way he had watched everything slip through his fingers, powerless. And then, the choice. To take the blame, or disappear. Langston had chosen the latter. It hadn't been bravery. It had been survival. And now, 20 years later, it had all come back. Detective Reynolds sat across from him, watching with quiet intensity. His hands rested flat on the table, but his fingers drummed a slow, thoughtful rhythm. "You were framed," Reynolds said finally. His voice was steady, but there was something else beneath it. A hint of guilt, perhaps. The realization that the system had failed someone who had once been its brightest star. Langston exhaled sharply, tossing the paper onto the table. His hands curled into fists, but he forced himself to unclench them. "I knew it," he said, voice low. Reynolds tilted his head. "Then why didn't you fight it?" Langston met his gaze, his blue eyes unreadable. "Because fighting meant losing everything. I had a choice, stand trial for something I didn't do and spend my life behind bars, or disappear." Reynolds studied him. "And you chose to disappear." Langston let out a bitter chuckle. "What would you have done, detective?" Reynolds didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples before letting out a long sigh. "Caldwell's confession is enough to reopen the case. But you're still in trouble." Langston arched a brow. "For what?" "You still ran," Reynolds said, folding his arms. "You evaded arrest. You've been living off the grid for 2 decades. That doesn't just go away." Langston leaned forward. "And what do you think happens if you throw me in prison? Who's going to explain to that little girl why the only person who helped her is locked away?" Reynolds hesitated. And that was when Langston knew. He wasn't just another case file to the detective. Something about this was personal. Langston pressed his advantage. "I don't care what happens to me," he admitted. "But I do care about those girls. That baby still isn't out of the woods. And Ava," he exhaled slowly. "She's too young to understand any of this, but she's smart enough to know what's happening." Reynolds sat in silence for a long moment. Then, finally, he reached for the document, flipping through the pages as if looking for an answer hidden between the lines. "There's a way out of this," he said at last. Langston lifted a brow. "What kind of way?" Reynolds met his gaze. "You testify, against Caldwell, against the board. You tell your side of the story in court." Langston didn't blink. "And if I do?" Reynolds hesitated, then sighed. "I'll push for a deal, maybe even an official pardon." Langston scoffed. "And you think that'll erase 20 years? "No," Reynolds admitted, "but it might give you a future." A silence settled between them. Langston looked down at the paper once more, his mind spinning. He had spent 2 decades running from his past. Maybe it was time to stop. Maybe it was time to fight. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for the pen and signed his name. Ava's Stand. At Mercy General, the waiting room was far too big for Ava. The chairs were stiff, the air too cold, and the adults spoke in whispers, glancing at her like she was made of glass. Lena Carter sat beside her, her warm brown eyes full of something Ava didn't quite understand, something between sympathy and admiration. "You doing okay, sweetheart?" Lena asked softly. Ava didn't answer. She just stared at the hallway where Naya had disappeared hours ago. She hadn't let go of the damp blanket Mr. Pete had wrapped Nia in. It was clutched tightly in her lap, her small fingers twisting into the fabric. "She's going to be okay," Lena reassured her. Ava swallowed hard. "They took him away." Lena sighed. "Yeah, baby, they did." Ava's fingers curled into fists. "That's not fair." "No," Lena agreed. "It's not." Ava sniffled, rubbing at her puffy eyes with the back of her sleeve. "He helped her. He saved her." Lena exhaled slowly. "I know." Ava turned to her, her small face set in determination. Then you have to help him. Lena blinked. Me? You work with kids, right? Ava said, her voice rising. You help kids when they don't got nobody. Lena hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. Then help him, Ava said fiercely. He don't got nobody. Lena let out a slow breath, watching Ava closely. Most kids in her position broke down, shut down, let the world push them in whatever direction it wanted. But not Ava. This little girl had fire. Lena had worked with a lot of children in crisis, but she had never met one like this. Ava wasn't just asking for help. She was demanding it. Lena made a decision then. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. All right, she murmured. Let's see what I can do. The beginning of the end. The courthouse smelled like old books and dust. The wood paneling was dark, polished with years of history, and the judge's bench stood like a towering monument of justice. Langston stood at the defendant's table, his hands resting on the polished wood, his heartbeat steady. For the first time in 20 years, he wasn't hiding. Across the room, Dr. Anthony Caldwell sat stiffly in his chair, his expression carefully composed. But Langston could see the tension in his posture, the slight tremor in his fingers as he adjusted his tie. He was afraid. And he should be. The courtroom doors swung open, and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Ava. She marched in, her small hand gripping Lena's tightly. But she wasn't scared. She wasn't crying. She was standing tall, her chin lifted. She had come to see him win. Langston exhaled slowly, something warm blooming in his chest. Then the judge entered. The trial began, and Peter Langston prepared to take back his life. The trial of the forgotten man. The courtroom awakens. The courtroom was silent, heavy with the weight of 2 decades of lies. The wooden benches creaked as people shifted in their seats, anticipation thick in the air. Reporters lined the back row, their notebooks open, pens poised, waiting for history to unfold. Peter Langston sat at the defendant's table, but he wasn't shackled. Not this time. Not yet. Today, he wasn't the ghost of a man living in the shadows. Today, he was fighting. Judge Eleanor Hayes adjusted her glasses, her expression unreadable as she surveyed the room. Her white hair was pulled into a tight bun, her gaze sharp. She had presided over cases for longer than most in this room had been alive. And now, she was about to judge a man who had been sentenced by the world before ever setting foot in her courtroom. Are both sides ready? She asked, her voice calm but firm. Richard Dan, the hospital's lead attorney, straightened his pristine suit. He looked like a man who had never lost a case in his life and had no intention of starting today. We are, Your Honor, he said smoothly. Detective Carl Reynolds stood beside Special Agent Carter at the prosecution table. Reynolds, the man who had once arrested Langston, was now here to help him clear his name. We're ready, Your Honor, Carter responded. Judge Hayes gave a slow nod. Then let's begin. And just like that, the trial of Peter Langston began. Ava's plea. Ava sat in the front row, her small hands clutching the worn blanket that had once wrapped around Nia. She barely moved, barely blinked. She was watching, waiting. She didn't understand all the big words the adults used, but she understood one thing. They were trying to take Mr. Pete away from her. Again. Lena Carter sat beside her, squeezing her hand gently. Ava barely noticed. Her dark eyes were locked on the man at the defendant's table. Mr. Pete wasn't wearing his old coat. He wasn't dirty or tired looking anymore. He wore a real suit, even though it looked like it didn't belong to him. His silver hair had been neatly combed, and his face was clean-shaven. But his eyes were the same. He looked over at Ava, just once, before the trial began. And he smiled. It wasn't big. It wasn't loud. But it was real. Ava's tiny heart clenched, and she sat up straighter. She didn't know much about trials. But she knew one thing. She had to make sure they didn't take him away. The man who lied. The first witness took the stand. Dr. Anthony Caldwell. the man who had ruined Langston's life. He was older now, his hair grayer, his skin softer, but his eyes were still the same. Cold, calculating. He sat stiffly in the witness chair, his fingers laced together on his lap, his mouth pressed into a thin line. Carter approached him, flipping open a folder filled with old documents. "Dr. Caldwell," Carter said, his voice even. "You were the chief of medicine at Mercy General Hospital 20 years ago, correct?" Caldwell nodded. "I was." "You were also the one who initially accused Dr. Langston of malpractice." "Yes." Carter picked up a document and held it up for the courtroom to see. "This is your original statement. In it, you claim that Dr. Langston was directly responsible for the death of Sarah Mitchell, an 8-year-old girl who died during surgery under his care." Caldwell didn't blink. "That is correct." Carter let the silence settle before picking up another document. This one was different. "This is your recent confession," Carter continued, his voice sharp. "Signed 3 days ago." Caldwell's face didn't change, but his fingers twitched slightly. "In this statement," Carter went on, "you admit that Dr. Langston was not responsible for Sarah Mitchell's death, that the anesthesia dosage was miscalculated by a resident, that the hospital board made the decision to pin the blame on Dr. Langston to protect one of their own." Murmurs erupted across the courtroom. Caldwell's lips thinned. "I was following orders." "Following orders." Carter's voice rose slightly. "You destroyed a man's life. You sent him into hiding for 20 years. Caldwell's mouth opened, then shut. For the first time, he looked uncomfortable. "I had no choice," he muttered. Carter slammed the file shut. "You had a choice. You just made the wrong one." The voice of truth. Ava's tiny fingers gripped the edge of the wooden bench. She didn't understand all of it, but she understood enough. They were saying Mr. Pete didn't do it, that the other man, the one on the stand, was the one who lied. Her heart pounded. She looked up at Lena, eyes wide. "Can I go up there?" Lena frowned. "Up where, sweetie?" Ava pointed at the witness stand. Lena's face softened. "Ava, I don't think." But Ava wasn't listening. She slid off the bench and marched forward. The courtroom gasped as the little girl stepped past the barrier, walking straight toward the judge's bench. "Your Honor," Carter said quickly, "this is." Judge Hayes held up a hand. She looked down at Ava, her expression unreadable. "And who are you, young lady?" Ava didn't hesitate. "My name is Ava," she said, standing as tall as she could. "And Mr. Pete saved my sister." The courtroom fell silent. Ava turned and pointed at Langston, her tiny hands shaking with emotion. "He made her breathe again," she continued. "Nobody else helped. The lady at the laundry place didn't help. The police didn't help. But he did." Carter's voice was gentle. "Ava." She turned to the judge again, her eyes pleading. "He's a good man," she whispered. "Please don't take him away." The judge's face softened, but she still had a job to do. "Ava," Judge Hayes said slowly, "we're not trying to take him away. We're trying to find out the truth." Ava's small hands clenched into fists. "You already know the truth," she said fiercely. "So why are you still asking?" The courtroom held its breath. And in that moment, in the eyes of everyone watching, the truth was clear. The verdict. The deliberation didn't take long. The evidence was undeniable. Dr. Caldwell was charged with conspiracy, falsifying evidence, and obstruction of justice. Peter Langston was exonerated, and just like that, the nightmare was over. The judge turned to Langston, her voice steady. "Dr. Langston, the court officially clears you of all wrongdoing in the case of Sarah Mitchell. The state will issue a full pardon for any prior charges related to your disappearance." Langston exhaled, his shoulders finally relaxing after 20 years of carrying the weight of a crime he never committed. The gavel struck, and it was over. The beginning of something new. Outside the courthouse, the air was crisp, the storm from the night before finally cleared. Langston stood on the steps, staring up at the sky. Free. After all these years. A small hand tugged at his coat. He looked down. Ava. She was looking up at him with those big dark eyes, the same ones that had pleaded with the judge, the same ones that had never doubted him. "You kept your promise," she said softly. Langston knelt down, his throat tight. "Yeah, I did." She hesitated. Then, in a rush, she threw her arms around his neck. Langston froze. Then, slowly, he wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. "You're not going to disappear again, right?" she whispered. Langston closed his eyes. "No," he promised. "Not this time." And for the first time in 20 years, he meant it. A life reclaimed. A man without chains. The courthouse steps were slick from the storm, but Peter Langston barely noticed. The crowd had thinned, reporters moving on to the next scandal, lawyers shaking hands and vanishing into black cars. But he remained. Still. Unmoving. For the first time in 20 years, he wasn't running. The past had finally loosened its grip on him. The weight of accusations lifted. His name, once synonymous with disgrace, had been restored. But freedom, true freedom, felt unfamiliar, like a suit that didn't quite fit. A tiny hand slipped into his. Peter looked down. Ava. Her fingers were warm, despite the chill in the air. She looked up at him, her dark eyes wide and searching. "You're free now," she said simply. Peter let out a slow breath, his eyes drifting over the city skyline. He had spent so long as a ghost, a man erased from the world. What did freedom even mean? He crouched down so they were eye level. "And what about you?" he asked gently. "Where are you and Nia going?" Ava's small fingers tightened around his. "I don't know." A shadow passed over her face. Lynna Carter, standing a few feet away, folded her arms as she listened. She had been watching over Ava and Nia since the night at the laundromat, navigating the red tape of child services. She had seen countless children shuffle through the system. But this case was different. Ava was different. "We're working on finding a placement," Lena said carefully. "Ava and Nia need a stable home." Ava's grip on Peter's sleeve tightened. "I don't want a new home." Lena sighed, crouching beside her. "Sweetheart, we just want to make sure you're safe." "I was safe with Mr. Pete." Lena's lips pressed together. Peter inhaled deeply, his mind racing. He wasn't a father. He wasn't even sure what he was anymore. But as he looked at Ava, the little girl who had trusted him when no one else would, he realized something. She was the first person in 20 years who had seen him as more than a mistake. She had saved him as much as he had saved her. And now she was asking him to stay. Peter swallowed hard, glancing at Lena. What would it take? Lena blinked. "What?" "For me to keep them," he said. The words shocked him as much as they did her. Lena hesitated. "Peter, the system doesn't work that way. You've been homeless, off the grid. There's no legal precedent for this." Peter's jaw tightened. "I have a name again, the history, and now I have a future." Lena exhaled, rubbing her temples. "You don't even have a home." Peter glanced down at Ava, who was staring up at him, her heart in her eyes. He squeezed her hand. "I will." Building something new. Peter had spent 20 years hiding from the world. Now he was stepping back into it. It wasn't easy. There were papers to sign, meetings with social workers, endless hoops to jump through. He was scrutinized from every angle: his past, his lack of a permanent residence, his financial instability. But he had something stronger than paperwork. He had people who believed in him. Detective Reynolds, who had once arrested him, now stood beside him, vouching for his character. Lena Carter, skeptical but hopeful, used every resource she had to fight for his case. Special Agent Carter pulled strings behind the scenes, ensuring that his past mistakes weren't used against him. And then there was Ava. She spoke at every meeting, answered every question, stared down every adult who tried to tell her that Peter wasn't the right choice. He's the only one who stayed, she would say, her voice unwavering. And it was the truth. So, against all odds, after months of legal battles, background checks, and interviews, Peter Langston became a guardian. Not just to Ava, but to Nia too. A house that became a home. The small house on the outskirts of the city wasn't much. The paint was peeling. The porch creaked. The windows rattled when the wind blew too hard. But to Ava and Nia, it was a castle. Peter watched as Ava ran through the overgrown grass, her laughter filling the empty yard. Nia, now healthy and strong, giggled in his arms, reaching for his silver hair. He still wasn't used to this. The quiet, the warmth, belonging. Lena stood beside him on the porch, arms crossed as she watched the girls. "You're adjusting." Peter let out a slow breath. "It still doesn't feel real." Lena smiled. "That's because you spent 20 years believing you didn't deserve this." Peter was silent. But she was right. For years, he had believed the world had no place for him, that he was better off as a nameless, forgotten man. Now he had proof that he was wrong. Lena nudged his arm. "You know, there's a shortage of good doctors." Peter smirked. "I haven't touched a scalpel in 20 years. "You saved a baby in a laundromat," Lena reminded him. "I'd say you haven't lost your touch." Peter exhaled. "You think they'd let me practice again?" Lena grinned. "We just got you custody of 2 kids. Anything is possible." Peter chuckled, shaking his head. The idea terrified him. But for the first time in years, it also excited him. Ava came running up the porch steps, breathless and beaming. "Mr. Pete, can we have pancakes for dinner?" Peter knelt, brushing a curl from her forehead. "Pancakes, huh?" She nodded eagerly. Peter glanced at Lena. "Is there a rule against that?" Lena laughed. "Nope. You're the parent now." The word hit him square in the chest. Parent. Peter swallowed hard, then looked at Ava. "Pancakes it is." Ava grinned, throwing her arms around his neck. He hugged her tightly, closing his eyes against the wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. He had spent 20 years running. Now he had a reason to stay. And for the first time in his life, Peter Langston was home. The end of the past. The beginning of forever. Some stories don't have happy endings. But this one did. It wasn't perfect. There were still struggles, still scars that wouldn't fade overnight. But in a quiet house with a creaky porch and pancakes for dinner, a man who had once been lost was finally found. And 2 little girls who had known only loss finally had a home. Not because of fate, not because of luck, but because one night, in the middle of a storm, a child had reached out to a man that no one else had seen. And he had chosen to save her. And in doing so, she had saved him right back.